Hi there, I'm in Vegas and we're gonna try Zoox. We just did a road trip down and we're at the Rivian Adventure Network juicing up after the trip. And honestly, Universal Handsfree was great, but more on that later, some great road trip content coming. For now, we're gonna try out the Robotaxi service, no steering wheel, just a cabin, you and your passengers. It's gonna be a blast, let's go check it out. If you haven't heard of Zoox before, it's a driverless robotaxi service that operates in San Francisco and in Las Vegas. My friends and I did a quick trip to Las Vegas, and that's where we tried it out on this one. And their vehicle is basically, well, for lack of a better word to describe it, a carriage. It's not really a car. In fact, that's even their slogan on the website is, "It's not a car." There's no steering wheel. It's just two seats on each side facing each other. Great for socializing and talking with your friends. A very different approach than Waymo, for example, that's just using modified Chrysler Pacificas and Jaguar I-Paces. So the vehicle is actually pretty cool. If you're in a Zoox service area, you might actually see some Toyota Highlanders driving around with all kinds of crazy LiDARs and sensors attached to the outside of them. If you don't look close, you might actually think that it's a Waymo. In fact, in my recent trip to Austin, I saw a whole bunch of these Zoox mapping vehicles driving around. They aren't offering any of their Robotaxi service yet. The carriages aren't driving around the streets of Austin at this time, but I did see the vehicles running around mapping, and I saw the same thing in Las Vegas. But none of these Highlanders are passenger vehicles. If you order a Zoox, it's going to be this little driverless carriage, which is pretty cool. Right now, they're very much operating in trial mode. It is a brand new service. It's all free, and there's a limited number of stops that you can choose from. When I was down there just this last weekend, I think there were a total of maybe 6 or 7 locations for pickup and drop off. What we did is we started at the Wynn and we rode to the Luxor, and then we took the same trip in reverse. And it was actually pretty interesting what it did. But before we get into how the drive actually went, I want to talk about the hardware and the sensors that are actually on the Zoox. Also, real quick, if you're new here, I like to cover a lot of vehicle technology topics, especially as they revolve around AI. And pretty soon, I've got another road trip planned to Las Vegas that's going to be a showdown between Rivian Gen 2 self-driving, Tesla Hardware 4 on FSD 14, and Comma AI. We're going to see how they all compare in this head-to-head. So if you're interested in seeing that, hit subscribe so you don't miss it. But going back to the Zoox hardware, they have one of these little sensor pods on each corner of the vehicle. They have LiDAR, they have several cameras, and infrared sensors, which is kind of interesting actually. It's using heat sensing essentially to tell the difference between objects, which is particularly helpful for sensing pedestrians, for example. So that one's kind of unique and pretty cool actually. Additionally, they also have microphones so they can listen for sirens for emergency vehicles coming by. And I actually did see a few emergency vehicles on the trip, which was kind of interesting. So that's the rundown of the hardware. As far as the software goes, they're using an AI driving model just like any of the other players in this space. And they have some rules-based frameworks around it that also can read from the sensors to halt the AI if needed. It feels a little bit rudimentary, and I think that may have come into play a few times during our drive. So let's talk about it. As the first Zoox approached, you could see that it was a real world that we're living in with a messy traffic situation. We were probably waiting for 10 minutes for it to make the final approach, entirely because of stupid humans around it. There was a backup of cars in the pickup line, people couldn't get around each other, and it was just stuck in a line of traffic for quite a long time actually. Eventually, with some human intervention making the other humans move, we were able to sort of get drivers through, and the Zoox was able to make the approach up to the pickup area. They are pretty strict about the pickup areas. It has to be within the designated valet lobby, so to speak, of the various venues that they pick up and drop off from. So even though it's really only like maybe 20 feet away from the designated pickup area, it wouldn't open the doors until it was good and sure it was in a safe place. Another interesting thing that we noticed is we were sort of standing in that carport area as it approached, and it just stopped. It did not like people being where they weren't supposed to be, and it wouldn't move any farther into the pickup area until all of the people were up on the curb. Once the people were on the curb, then it proceeded to move. So, definitely overcautious, but that was the first impression. Then, as we approached, you push the button on the app and the doors open, and it's a pretty cool little cabin. It's 2 seats on each side facing each other, fairly comfortable, very nice materials in there. It seems like hard wearing, but nice materials. And there's a little touch screen with controls for climate, for music, and you can touch the button for assistance as well, which we accidentally did at one point.
Hi, this is Lauren with Zoox support on a recorded line. Does anyone need any emergency services?
No, we just accidentally pressed the button. Sorry.
Trying to turn on the light. Sorry.
And of course, they were very nice to us. They got on the phone, made sure everyone was okay, and we moved on with the trip. As it drove, I noticed that it was actually pretty aggressive in Las Vegas traffic. And to be quite honest, you kind of have to be aggressive on this trip. You have to turn your turn signal on and start moving over, even if it isn't completely clear yet. The action of moving over a little bit in the lane sort of sends the body language that you're going to be getting over. And sometimes people won't let you in unless you exhibit this body language. And it did so quite naturally. It felt pretty good. However, not everything felt natural. There were a few times when it encountered a situation that it wasn't entirely sure about, and it kind of got on the brakes rather harshly. It wasn't a full-on slam on the brakes, phantom brake situation, but it definitely was a little bit jarring a couple of times. One such instance was actually when we were driving by an area where there were some police that were redirecting traffic. I think one of the roads that we were supposed to go down was actually blocked off. So the Zoox sort of slowed down and kind of jittered a little bit and paused and then continued on. And there was another area where there were some cones and the traffic lane split. Unfortunately, I didn't really get good footage of this because the Zoox is fairly closed off since there's no windshield per se. But as it approached the cones, you could definitely feel the steering kind of jostle back and forth a little bit, and there's a little bit of twitchiness there. So there were definitely a couple moments of this twitchy unsureness, but it was really a small footnote in the drive in and of itself. In fact, once we got past the spot, maybe 2 minutes later, we had another call come in from Zoox service, and they called to notify us that we had been redirected on our route and wanted to make sure that everything was okay. So we explained that there were some police that were redirecting traffic and everything was fine. Rather interesting, though, it would be nice on the Zoox screen if it would show the actual route that we're taking. It doesn't necessarily show you the route directly. It just shows you how much time is left in your ride and if there's a turn coming up. And that's pretty much all the detail you get. So that would be a nice little additional thing that they could add to it. And that was the first ride. Honestly, for a completely free Robotaxi ride, I had no complaints. We then rode it back the other direction because, let's be honest, we weren't necessarily trying to get anywhere. We just wanted to ride in the Zoox. I'm sure at some point it will become more useful for people to actually get from point A to point B as they add more of these pickup and drop off locations. In fact, the Sphere, I hear, is getting a pickup and drop off location hopefully soon. So that'd be pretty cool. But on the ride back, we actually encountered another different issue where there was an ambulance that was driving by. The ambulance had its lights going, but there were no sirens. And watching the reaction to that was actually kind of interesting. We were approaching an intersection and we were in the left turn lane. And the Zoox didn't really seem to move over for the ambulance. We were already in the left of the lane, so it kind of made room anyway, just because of the direction that we were headed anyway. So that was kind of odd and maybe a little disconcerting that it didn't necessarily move over for the ambulance and actually pull off to the side. That said, it did stop rather abruptly. Again, when these situations arise, it doesn't seem to react very smoothly. But it did stop at a green light so that the ambulance could go through. And once the ambulance was passed, it actually proceeded pretty quickly, and the rest of the ride was pretty natural. So we got lucky that we got to see a few challenging situations for the Zoox, and it handled it pretty well. Definitely not the smoothest on all of it, but it's probably only up from here. They're in the very early stages where they're still giving free rides to people and still running around with their mapping vehicles, gathering additional data. So I'm really excited to see where it goes from here. But stepping back and taking a look at the bigger picture, I think the Zoox service actually gives us a pretty good clue of where the future of vehicle autonomy goes. Redundancy seems to be the name of the game. You see this with Zoox, you see this with Waymo, you see this with what Rivian is now talking about with the R2 and the LiDAR, adding multiple different kinds of sensors that have redundancy. This is nothing new to the world of transportation. In airplanes, they have lots of redundancies, 2 or 3 systems that all complement each other so that if one goes down or there's a disagreement between multiple different kinds of sensors, you can still proceed with reasonable safety because you have another redundancy layer to rely on. And so in this case, you have 4 layers of redundancy in some regard. They don't necessarily all overlap entirely, but you've got cameras, LiDARs, radars, and the infrared heat sensors that are all gathering data from the world around it. So there's no shortage coming there. It's probably a little over redundant, probably a little costly to do it this way. But honestly, I think that's the future of where we're going with full level 4 autonomy like this. Little side note, level 4 autonomy means that no driver is required, and within its limited operating area, it can just do its thing without any intervention. Level 3 autonomy is where you can take your eyes off of the road, you can text, you can watch a movie, but you still have to be there as the driver, and the car can still prompt you to take over if it feels that you need to. I think that in order to make that jump from level 3 to level 4, where there is no driver intervention, you really do need that extra layer of redundancies with different kinds of sensors. And that's Zoox. But of course, I can't talk about this trip to Las Vegas without making at least a brief mention of Rivian Autonomy and how Universal Handsfree did on my journey from Utah, where I live, to Las Vegas. It's about a 6-hour drive, and honestly, it was fantastic. It did very well, much better than Highway Assist would have done on the same trip with previous versions of the software. That said, there's definitely still some work that needs to be done. I think when it comes to the long distance trip, the biggest Achilles heel that I noticed over and over again was driving on sections where there's only 2 lanes of traffic when passing semi-trucks. It would regularly get skittish and get on the brakes when we were passing the semi-truck. It seemed to be overly cautious that there was a truck coming into our lane. It feels to me that the decision-making of the model isn't necessarily the holdup here. It's the perception of the model. It feels like the perception still needs more work to be able to determine that no, that semi-truck is not in fact encroaching on our lane. I could be wrong, but that's kind of what it feels like. The decision making is probably like an 8 out of 10, and the perception is maybe like a 6 out of 10. So we'll see how it goes. Perception always continually gets better with the more data they collect. Also of note on this road trip, the charging curve is so much better than it used to be on the max packs for Rivian. It was a much flatter 200 kilowatt curve all the way up to 50 or 60%, which is so much better than it was. Certainly not industry leading, but it definitely was an improvement. I definitely could go into more detail on how it did in the long road trip context, but I'm going to save that for the Showdown video, where we go against the Tesla and Comma AI systems. So make sure you're subscribed for that. Also, if you're buying a Rivian, use my referral code down below. You'll get up to 500 points to the gear shop and 3 months of charging. Thanks for watching. Until the next one. That's not why we're... One more time. Okay, here we go. Hardware 14 FSD. Sorry, hardware 4 FSD. Hardware 14, my gosh, we're way in the future. Let's go. All right, come on. Come on.